Okay. I think we're live. I hope so. If um, Anyway, this is Jeffrey Williams. Welcome to Too Late for the Gods. And tonight we're going to be having a discussion with the writer John Buck, which I'm really looking forward to. It's two interesting topics. Um, we probably will get to free will. I hope so. I saw John's recent debate, enjoyed it very much, and agreed
Oh, thanks.
with a good deal of what he said. But we're going to start out talking about metaphysics, which is a big subject of mine and one of the major causes of my becoming an atheist. Metaphysics is a word that means different things to different schools of thought. But at least in the continental tradition, for the last 200 years, there's been two major movements. One is to eliminate metaphysics, and the other is to maybe demote somewhat reason for aesthetic knowledge. At the time of Kant, that was already happening. You had the Romantics beginning up, but then through Nietzsche and Heidegger, aesthetic knowledge became to be the major focus. And then on the other side with Wittgenstein, you also had a renunciation of all metaphysics, but he didn't have the aesthetic knowledge. He said it's the reality, the ultimate reality, just can't be spoken. So be quiet.
Right. Yeah. I just want to let you know, it looks like you have the StreamYard sort of like notification up right here. I think if you can click on it to like minimize it just so it's not taking up so much space. There I am. I'm back.
Yeah, you're back, but that is still there. Why is that there? I've never had that problem before, but it's been nothing but technical glitches for the last hour for me. So I'm not
maybe
surprised.
try highlighting a comment on the side, and that might be able to like take it up, and then you can unhighlight it, and that might clear the space.
And then unhighlight it. There we go.
There
Thank you, John.
Yeah, no problem.
I will be the first to admit I have no technical abilities or expertise at all. It is a major accomplishment for me every time I'm able to string together a video on iMovie. And now we're into things that I have no understanding.
Oh yeah.
But I hope we have some people out there. The intention is to include your comments or discussions later on as we get through a couple of these topics. Makes things much more interesting if it's interactive. For those of you who are new to the channel, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Jeffrey Williams. Most people know me as a simple, semi-literate biker. I live under a bridge. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Do you really live under a bridge?
Yeah, you ever see the picture, that begins and ends my videos? That's the bridge I live under. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I really am. Well, I will say this, I really am a biker.
Cool.
I've been riding since I was 15. I haven't raced in 2 years, but I want to start racing again. I ride a Honda CBR.
Yeah, that sounds fun. Okay, so I'm John Buck. I was raised in a sort of fundamentalist, sort of neo-Protestant home until I guess through my deep interest in Jordan Peterson. He sort of brought up new interest in philosophy and sort of deep thinking and questioning of the sort of like assumptions that I was brought up in, and gave me a lot more to, I guess, sort of think about on the deeper side of life. From there, I sort of like took on a bit of a journey within philosophy and some questionings, which I never had a full I guess draw towards atheism. I don't know if it's something that's just sort of innate within me as a sort of predisposition towards theism, and so it seemed like most sort of alternate worldviews that precluded atheism were just sort of dead options for me. So William James, he has sort of the understanding of like live options and dead options in regards to worldviews. So from that, I guess, sort of journey, I started looking into both Eastern Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church, just to get a better understanding of my Christian upbringing. And then eventually, after, I guess, 2 years of attending an Orthodox church, decided to give a further look into sort of the Catholic teaching. I was already familiar with like Thomas Aquinas and his sort of like Thomistic arguments for God's existence, but also sort of like bridging Aristotelian sort of philosophy into Christianity, which I found quite fascinating, because like coming from a sort of fundamentalist upbringing is just like you take the Bible at its face value without having any sort of like laden philosophy to like understand the rest of the world from that. So I really appreciated Thomas Aquinas's sort of like real appreciation of reason and faith connected together in a way that sort of made sense, from especially tied to the sort of institutional power of the Catholic Church during the medieval period. So anyway, just this last Easter, I joined the Catholic Church, and so I've been living out my days since then as a bad Catholic, a very new bad Catholic. But yeah, that's sort of my, I guess, story.
Okay, thank you. Being influenced by Aquinas, of course, metaphysics would pretty much underlie everything in your thought. My being a Heideggerian, I have no role for metaphysics at all. So this would be an interesting conversation. And I just want to repeat, to people who are watching, this isn't a debate. This is, I enjoy having philosophical conversations with people of different viewpoints. I had Kyle Alander on here for 2 videos, fantastic videos. Had a great one with Craig Reed last week. And it's just exploratory conversation. We're pretty set in our ways, probably both of us, and but we're not here to score points. We're here to expand our understanding of other viewpoints.
Yeah. So I've got a few. I just want to sort of clarify, just so that my understanding and your understanding can be laid out on the table. My sort of understanding of, like, let's say, phenomenology, from at least sort of a basic Heideggerian understanding, is just experience as experience is, without like having any sort of inferential understanding of like what's underlying that experience. So like, so the fact that I'm experiencing reality with my hands in front of me and things like that is sort of first fundamental. That's going to be my epistemic starting point. And then, like, as I sort of understand Heideggerian thought, is like, you can't go past that, really. You're starting with your phenomenology, and then any sort of like metaphysical postulations beyond that is just going to be sort of, I guess, beyond what it is to be a human, or to be experiencing things, to be being as is. But maybe I'm misunderstanding some of Heideggerian
I think that's an explanation of the very early Heidegger of being in time. Much as Wittgenstein renounced analytic philosophy in trying to understand the world through propositional logic, Heidegger, fairly early on, renounced phenomenology as being stuck in metaphysics. It's why he never finished Being in Time. He finished 2/3 of part 1 and never started part 2. He renounced it, so that's an error. In fact, later on in his life, he referred to Being in Time as an example of the error of writing too soon, much as Wittgenstein talked that way about the Tractatus. Heidegger is, as Wittgenstein, renounced philosophy in general. He said philosophy was a 2,500-year error. Heidegger was it. I don't know how to do this quickly, but I'm going to try. For Heidegger, remember I talked about the 2 major the flows in in intellectual history of the last 200 years were renunciation of metaphysics and the ascension of aesthetic knowledge. Now, for Heidegger, his inquiry was into being, sein, as the ground of everything. In graduate school, I had a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who was a continental philosopher and a Christian, who often told me that theologians in Europe are fascinated with Heidegger and Nietzsche because they ask theological questions, but look for the answers purely in the physical world of being. Mm-hmm. Heidegger saw metaphysics. When we talk about metaphysics, I'll get into this more, but metaphysics was something that it was the basis of technology. It was practical. It gave us some information that was correct, in a superficial way, but it could never get to the truth. Impossible to get to the truth. Now, here's where Heidegger and Wittgenstein differed. They both saw underlying reality as das Mystische, in German, the mystical. Wittgenstein said, you can't say anything about it, so just be quiet. Heidegger said, you can approach it through poetic language, aesthetically. You can know being, the truth of being aesthetically. I mean, there's more truth in a Beethoven symphony than there is in both volumes of Einstein's relativity. But we understand things through poetic language, which kind of builds off of Nietzsche's idea of this. It was the same thing. We live, we experience, we know aesthetically. For Nietzsche, it was music. For Heidegger, it was poetry, which is language still dripping with the music before it falls into the everyday language. So you can, for Heidegger and for Nietzsche, understand underlying reality if you embrace physicality as it is and you hold on tight, because it's ultimately overwhelming. Heidegger wrote an essay after his turn, when he had renounced phenomenology. They call that the turn, die Kehre. He wrote an essay called Wozu dichte? It comes from a Hölderlin poem, Wozu dichte in dürftiger Zeit, which means what are poets for in time of destitution? And what Heidegger says is we're in a time of destitution right now. We're uprooted. We don't even know the question of being, let alone know how to go at it. What poets are for is to go out there, face being, catch the lightning bolts, bring them back to us, and go mad in the process. But that's how we're going to get out of our time of destitution, which is very much like Nietzsche's time of vertigo. The madman in section 125 of The Gay Science announced the death of God. Said, now what are we going to do? Up is down, down is up. I mean, it was pure vertigo. What are we going to do now? We're still in that time of vertigo. We're still in that time of destitution. And we need some poets to catch some lightning bolts for us. That's Heidegger in a nutshell, and I barely scratched the surface. Did that make any sense at all?
No, yeah, it made plenty of sense. Okay, yeah, so that's great. So, okay, we probably aren't going to be able to get fully to metaphysics, like how to justify metaphysics through this, but maybe I can at least do something to maybe help get close, maybe. So my sort of first love in philosophy was actually through William James, the American pragmatist. And so he was sort of a founder, I mean, not quite exactly a founder of the pragmatist movement. Is sort of like the core American sort of philosophy. There's not really other American philosophers quite like William James. And sort of his understanding, it was that where we cannot know something as it is, we can know it by its effects and how it like produces for us these particular results that we're expecting from it. Right. So I think Charles Sanders Peirce, who is a contemporary and also very much a pragmatist, he said that truth is sort of like the satisfactions of doubt. So when you have some sort of doubt or something like that, you might go through the process of doubting up until you reach a certain point where you cannot doubt any further. And that is essentially truth for the pragmatist perspective, that which you cannot doubt. And see, it's not really a sort of metaphysical claim about like what truth is as truth. It's rather, what is truth in regards to its relation to us? What is it about us that we cannot doubt this thing that is truth? That's something, a sort of pragmatist approach to philosophy that, while I've since somewhat become less, I guess, skeptical in regards to how much we can attain about reality, I still find that an absolutely great sort of epistemic starting point, and maybe even like under the recognition that like there's certain things that we cannot know for sure, we can at least know it from a pragmatic understanding of like, okay, and that sort of analyzing the different options available to us. How are we supposed to act? Well, we can still utilize this sort of pragmatic understanding. So what are your sort of thoughts on truth as that which we cannot doubt?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
I studied philosophy at University of Chicago, which is the department that Carnap set up, who also,
okay.
Yeah, he migrated to pragmatism also. So the philosophy department was solidly like half pragmatism, half Anglo-American analytic. Carnap had some roots in that before we went the pragmatist route. So I mean, yeah, I was inundated in William James, William S. Peirce, and people like that. What I wonder about is all of those guys were on the refutation of metaphysics train. They looked, I mean, they didn't even want to consider the question of metaphysics. They were looking at, as you said, results. The results correspond with what you know, and it was purely pragmatic.
Right, like if you were to ask a pragmatist, like, does a tree disappear whenever you're not looking at it, versus like, does it retain there every time I'm looking at it? Like,
yeah, that's not even a question for them.
Yeah, it's not a meanubeful question to a pragmatist.
No, it isn't. Right. Nor, are things like the difference between, substance or, substrates, physical, the material versus immaterial. Those are all metaphysical questions that the pragmatists had no patience for, nor did most of the analytic philosophers. So how do you go from that to Augustinian? I mean, Thomistic metaphysics.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't know if this is the exact like direct route I've taken, but at least lately. So I've been doing more study into epistemology. I had this sort of nagging question for a while of like, okay, there's a couple like questions of skepticism that are sort of out there. How is it that people have sort of tried to respond to those questions of skepticism? Sort of like Descartes' demon, that whole sort of thing.
Right.
And so I started writing a sort of video essay. That's something I do in my sort of spare time, is like when I have some sort of like philosophical problem on my hand, I have to write it out just to sort of understand it from all sides as best as I can. So I started writing this essay or like video essay, like I guess a year and a half ago, but I had like even before that, I still had the questions sort of going. And what I wanted to do was to sort of steelman the skeptic's concern as strong as I possibly could. And I ended up like trying to formulate, and just to make it concise and better understood in each of the sort of like steps of the sort of skeptical argument. to the point of right now I have like a Word document that's probably like, oh man, I have it open on my tab. It's probably like some 50 something pages long. The whole video may not be that long. I might cut it into shorter parts, but that's what I have right now. And what I did was for each, since there's like various skeptical arguments, I wanted to sort of steelman each particular one from Descartes, from Kant, from Hume, from Alvin Plantinga even. I was sort of like taking Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism and thought, I mean, this isn't just against naturalism. It's as long as we hold that like organisms such as you or I are capable of like affecting the cognitive processing systems of our progenitors. I mean, there could still be a concern of like, oh, if I'm gravitated towards false realities, I'm going to still generate cognitive faculties that are also inclined towards those false realities. So I was like taking that and like reformulating it so it's a global sort of skeptical scenario, not just for the naturalists, but for the theists as well, and for anybody else, just given the fact of evolution. In fact, Donald Hoffman, he has a book, what is it? Like The Myth of Reality or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. And I read that book, loved it. And he's basically taking that sort of evolutionary argument against naturalism, but just making it as a general case given evolution. Like, forget naturalism. It's just the evolutionary argument against realism, basically. I mean, he's an idealist. He's a sort of objective idealist, but it's still a really fascinating argument given sort of like contemporary evolutionary theory. Anyway, so what I did was taking all those sort of skeptical concerns, strengthen them as strong as I possibly could. And what I intended actually in writing this whole video essay was to take for granted that those skeptical concerns were successful. They like threw out all sorts of any hope for us to have any sort of knowledge at all, with the sort of recovery within pragmatism, where we take, okay, while it's not the case that we can know reality as it is, we can know reality by its effects, and then from there sort of develop some sort of worldview based upon what sorts of effects we want to produce. Now, that was my like goal going into writing this thing. But as I was reading through some of the responses, I became more infatuated with this response to Edmund Gettier. So Edmund Gettier sort of raised this like it's a 3-page paper against the common understanding of knowledge, which was justified true belief. Basically, in order to have knowledge, you have to believe that something is the case. You have to be justified in your belief that that is the case. And that belief must correspond with reality. It must be true. So that was, for a long time, since Plato pretty much, that was sort of the common understanding of what knowledge is. Edmund Gettier, just on a lark, I guess he was like on it. He had to do some sort of writing, and so he just wrote up this 3-page paper, and it basically revolutionized all of epistemology. In that, like, gave epistemologists the whole concern of like, okay, shoot, we had this prior understanding of knowledge, and now he's sort of like flipped it on its head. Now, what I really appreciated in sort of going through the different various responses that are out there, like even Alvin Plantinga has sort of a response to Edmund Gettier to sort of like, how can we, like, he'll say a warranted true belief is now a qualification for knowledge instead of a justified true belief. I'm not quite a fan of Plantinga's sort of response, but I am a fan of, what is it? Alvin Goldman? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Alvin Goldman. His response was to take a causal theory of knowledge, where the S knows that P insofar as S's belief that P was due to P being true. So basically, the reason that I came to believe P was because P is actually true. So I look outside, I see the leaves are green. That only qualifies as knowledge if the fact of the leaves being green caused me to believe that those leaves were actually green. Now, he does have the sort of problem, I think, in that he sort of leaves off justification. Like, he just takes the fact that there's some sort of causal connection between the truth of the matter and my belief in the matter, that suddenly qualifies as knowledge. That's a problem. You still need to have yeah, you still need to have reasons to think that internal to you, that are reasons to think that it actually is the case. Now, so that was my sort of like new favored, like, okay, this is a viable, I think, theory of at least knowledge in order to sort of respond to Edmund Gettier and his sort of problem for the definition of knowledge. Aside from that, I'd also listened to and did some reading from people like, what is it, Robert Audi? Robert Audi and Michael Huemer. So Robert Audi, he has a couple of books on epistemology, and he sort of takes a basic sort of understanding of like epistemology starts from the senses. And so like we're not doing any sort of inferential judgment in order to arrive at certain beliefs. Rather, they are just appeared to us at hand. Like, it's not that like I'm inferring that the leaves are green outside when I look out my window off of like some steps of premises or anything like that. It's rather I'm looking out my window and I'm seeing that the leaves are green. And so he's sort of like bringing up the that knowledge, at least firsthand knowledge, is non-inferential. It's not based upon prior beliefs. It's rather something that is immediate to us in a sort of sense. Now, also Michael Huemer. Is it Michael Huemer? Yeah, Michael Huemer. He's an interesting guy. He's sort of like all over the map in regards to contemporary philosophy. He's I guess basically like he's a political philosopher because he defends libertarianism, but he's also like big on meta-ethics because he defends moral realism. And he also, in regards to epistemology, he defends a position known as phenomenal conservatism, which is a sort of theory of justification, where if it seems to S, that P, so S just represents any sort of subject. So if it seems to S, say myself, that P, that some proposition is true, then absent any sort of defeaters for P, S is justified to believe that P, or at least has some degree of justification to believe that P. So he's sort of taking the case that like, if you have some sort of immediate experience of something and you have no reason to doubt your immediate experiences, then you have a sort of prima facie justification for believing that that experience is veridical. It represents or like provides you some connection with reality. Now, that's not to like get out of jail free card there. There are still going to be concerns of like, oh, you're provided with some reason to doubt this immediate experience. Like, let's say you have this experience of there's a snake in my room, but prior to this, you recall that your doctor gave you some sort of medication that might cause hallucinations, such as like people have been said snakes or something like that. That's when that's now a defeater for your immediate experience of a snake in your room. So you no longer have that justification to believe that that snake is there. So anyway, that theory of knowledge from Alvin Goldman, and then that theory of justification from Michael Huemer connected together for me a sort of new understanding of like, oh, here's how you can have knowledge through justification, because you can't deny that we have experiences. And now there's still going to be sort of skeptical concerns from the people like Descartes or Kant. But as long as you can sort of deal with those skeptical concerns and show that how they don't actually provide you with a defeater for your initial position, that's a way in which, so long as your initial position corresponds with reality accurately, that you can have knowledge. And so long as your belief was actually formed due to it being true. Now, there's going to be cases where you just form a belief with having no connection at all to reality. You just sort of like the idea of it. Like, I like the idea that God exists. And that's not going to have any sort of like causal connection between the truth of the matter and your belief in the matter, unless you want to like take a sort of Plantingian approach and say that, oh, God would like inculcate into you this sort of like desire for God beliefs, and then maybe like because there's that sort of like proper functionalist definition in there. But I'm not a proper functionalist like Alvin Plantinga. I'm a causal theorist like Alvin Goldman, because I think that you can have knowledge even if you weren't like programmed to believe in certain things due to some sort of like designer, be it through evolution or through some sort of like scientist or anything like that. I think just so long as there's that causal connection between the truth of the matter and the formation of your belief in that. Okay, so that's, I guess, my sort of like defense of how we could potentially ground metaphysical knowledge.
I mean, everything that you walked through, first of all, doesn't require any sort of metaphysics. And second, the metaphysics, like when you refer to Plantinga, that seems to be just sort of an ad hoc putting metaphysics on top of something where it doesn't need to be there. But I've got a few questions, if you don't mind. You gave the example that, you know, the snake's not real because the doctor gave you something that's potentially hallucinatory. People like Donald Hoffman, Anil Sith, say that everything's hallucinatory. That it's sort of it's a 21st century Kantian epistemology. Going back to Kant, you know, all authentic knowledge comes through the senses. And we have these ingrained a priori modes of understanding. We have two sensibilities, time and space, which are purely subjective, don't exist outside our subjectivity. The world in itself, or things in themselves, do not exist in time and space. Also, they don't exist as objects. These are things that we construct in our imaginations in order to understand the world around us in a way that we can manipulate it. We turn it into objects, but it's a gross simplification, and it's really a construct. Now, for Kant, there is a definite connection. We can't imagine it to be anything at all. The sense data comes in, and it's conditioned by whatever is sending the sense data. But we take that conditioned sense data and represent it as something else. You talked about, well, the leaf is green. Well, no, it's not. Green is something that we add to it. There is no green outside of subjectivity. In fact, it's not even a leaf. What we think of as a leaf is, in the most elementary sense, an incredibly complex interplay of quantum fields. It's waves. The wall in front of you isn't a solid. It's a quantum. It's an interplay of quantum fields with a certain tensile strength in an energy field, and it bounces photons at us. And we represent those photons as a solid color that we take as a solid thing. It's not a solid thing. It's just an energy field that is, you know, unless we really punch through with our fists, we can't break that field. It's empty space is what it is. The actual quanta that make it up are very, very far spread apart. It's empty space other than waves of energy. So we don't see in reality anything at all like it is. In fact, we can't, because reality doesn't exist in time and space, and we can't even say something that isn't prefaced in time and space. All of our words, all of our concepts, all of our ability to understand are spatial and temporal. Not only that, it's not causal at that level. So causality, reason itself doesn't apply there. And we have things like superposition, where, you know, like Dirac's chalk, it's here and it's here at the same time. Reality isn't compelled to obey our innate a priori sensibilities and modes of or categories of understanding. So, you know, for Kant, he didn't care about it so much because the sense of data is conditioned. We're talking about objectives, reality. We're talking about objectification that does have enough correspondence that we can We can't know the thing in itself. That's not our world. We don't worry about that. We live in the objective world, but it works because there is some correspondence. That weakens a bit with people like Donald Hoffman, but still there is a correspondence. Like Donald Hoffman says, if a truck's hurtling at him, he doesn't take that literally, but he does take it seriously. But we do project outward our representations, conditioned by a priori categories of understanding and our innate sensibilities of time and space, even though they don't actually exist. So what you've outlined is what's often called naive realism, and many analytic philosophers just simply assume naive realism, and the rest of us who aren't analytic philosophers don't take them seriously for that very reason.
Right.
But how would you react to? I mean, part of there's a pragmatic aspect, because objectification does work to a degree. It's practical in limitation. Are you familiar with Eugene Wigner?
The physicist?
Yeah, he won a Nobel Prize for physics in '63. He was a mathematical physicist. He was also a brilliant philosopher. And he developed what he called the epistemological law of empiricism. And he developed this from a brilliant deduction of how mathematics began as an aesthetic endeavor, and at the time when we became an agricultural species, it developed practical implications, and there's parallels to reason also. But anyway, there is no ontological connection between mathematics and reason and the real physical world.
Okay, so I hear you right now speaking metaphysics to me. You're saying the world is not actually this way. Like time and space are not actual aspects of the world, they're aspects of the mind. You're like drawing a sort of an inference from the fact that temporality and spatiality are figments of the mind, and then assuming from that temporality and spatiality are not correspondent with reality. Well, so you're saying like the color green is not something actually there in the world, but that's a metaphysical claim that you're making.
Well, it isn't exactly, but I'm also not making my claims. I'm talking from the perspective of these guys. But let me jump a minute to answer your question, because this is how I would approach it. Is all I know is the physicality that impinges on my senses, which excludes anything metaphysical. Everything is through the senses. I've got two modes of understanding, and I know that because I employ them. We always have employed them. We all know them instinctively. There's the primordial aesthetic knowledge and the more recent rational knowledge. And they tell me different things. And all I know is what those things tell me. The rational knowledge is in fact metaphysical. And Heidegger has a radical deduction of metaphysics, and I'll get to that, but it's what I totally subscribe to, but it makes all of rational thought metaphysical. And I use it because it has practical value. It doesn't tell me anything true about the universe. I have aesthetic knowledge that tells me things that are true about the universe, but I can't categorize them scientifically. I can only express them aesthetically. The truth that you get when you listen to a Beethoven symphony, the truth that of what the essence of morality is that you get in the final 10 to 15 pages of the Brothers Karamazov. It's an aesthetic knowledge that tells you far more about morality than any construct that an analytic philosopher could ever devise.
Yeah, like try to read Kant's like a defense of the categorical imperative versus like yeah.
But if we get to free will, that's going to be an important point.
Okay.
But I am not metaphysical in that I don't try to say what cannot be said. I'll sing what can be sung.
Right. Okay. Well, it does seem like you're sometimes saying what cannot be said when you're saying that, like, okay, we cannot have access to reality as it is. That seems like you're sort of like placing a limitation upon human reasoning.
I didn't say that. I think we get much closer through aesthetic. Aesthetic knowledge gives us direct revelation of being. It's the rational, scientific, objective knowledge that gives us some correct things within limited space, time, and chosen events. And that's what I was getting at with Wigner. Just to get back to Wigner, what he said is there is no connection, no ontological connection between reason and mathematics and the physical world, other than we sort of create small closed physical systems.
Did he write the paper like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics? Okay.
Yeah, a paper that William Lane Craig totally either misunderstood, which I don't think, because he's too well educated to misunderstand it, but rather dishonestly misrepresented it. I've got something on my blog where I talk about that. But yeah, Craig tried to make it sound like Wigner was saying there's this magical, miraculous correspondence between mathematics and reality. And so that means that the world is really rational, and that could only come from the mind of God. Wigner meant exactly the opposite. Wigner's, in his... So
do you think Wigner was taking a sort of like anti-realist or maybe a scientific anti-realist approach and saying that the mathematical description doesn't even correspond with reality as experiential, maybe?
Not quite that radical. Not quite that radical. But first of all, a background on that essay was really a paper that he delivered in, I believe, 1961 at Columbia to some mathematicians who were somewhat mystical. They were purely on the aesthetic side of mathematics and didn't really care about its practical side, but they were mystical in their awe that there's this connection between mathematics and the world, and it's a miraculous. Wigner was a very subtle but a very polite man, and he didn't want to come out and say, "You guys are nuts." But he, in fact, did very subtly walk through why they were nuts. And what he said is, since the time of Newton, the language of physics is mathematics. And it worked pretty well in Newtonian physics. And he talked about because, in fact, reason and mathematics evolved in that very thin slice of reality, but it works okay there. And it's very limited in time, space, and chosen events.
Right. Like it doesn't work on the very large things and on the very small things, right?
Exactly, it doesn't. Now, when you get to the macro, when you get with relativity, it becomes counterintuitive, but we can mathematically model it if we limit, the macro side, the macro space. We don't come too small, we don't go too large, and we choose what events we want to look at. And then we come up with relativity. Unfortunately, it conflicts with Newtonian physics, and then conflicts with quantum physics, because now we're in a different thin slice of reality. So it requires different assumptions and different mathematics. All three of them use different mathematics with different assumptions. Another point that William Lane Craig dishonestly misrepresented. He said, no, you don't have to devise new mathematics. Yeah, you do.
I see. So if Wigner was sort of saying that here's reality, but in order to mathematically describe it, we can't be consistent with our mathematics. We have to use differing mathematics depending upon which part of reality we're actually referring to.
Exactly. Newton had to invent calculus. Einstein thought he had to invent a new geometry until a friend of his pointed out that Riemann had already done that. So Riemannian geometry covered that, but neither of those covered quantum mechanics.
Right.
They had to resort to algebraic expressions in Hilbert space. So yeah, it's different assumptions, different chosen events, and you can't put them together. And so what he ends with saying is, we've been very, very lucky so far that there has been somewhat of a connection, but we can't, we're now dealing with things that are unquestionably beyond our ability to grasp outside of time and space and causality, and we can't expect mathematics to really explain, to hold that much longer. But on top of that, you will never get one. I mean, they're always, physicists refuse to give up the idea of an orderly universe that is run by a few simple physical laws, but it isn't that way. And they're always looking for the grand unification theory, which, according to Wigner, is fundamentally impossible because the world isn't mathematical. And then you see, things like Penrose now with the world is not computational. Ravelli goes that way also. You're not going to get one theory of the universe that's going to work, because we only understand things within very small limitations of space-time and chosen events. But it gets worse, because you can take that same slice of space-time and chosen events and come up with contradictory explanations that are both inherently coherent. They're internally coherent, but they mutually contradict. And he goes back to Poincaré's essay on the four geometries, where you had four separate geometries, absolutely internally consistent, with contradictory assumptions. For example, Euclidean geometry assumes that parallel lines will never meet. Riemannian geometry says they can't help but meet. But both internally consistent, because they're constructions. As long as we limit time, space, and events, we can construct a rational system to explain it. But it's a representation. And now that, in the 21st century, I talked a bit about Penrose, and it's non-computational, and you've got Ravelli, who says time itself works that way. Everything, time works off of entropy, but there is no central entropy to the universe. There is no central time to the universe. There's only small, localized quantum systems. And from that, we can determine time from a perspective. He gives a great example. It didn't start with him, but it makes the point. Traditionally, we've thought of one direction of time, and there was one system, one progression of entropy starting with the Big Bang. But he goes, it's just a matter of perspective. Take a brand new deck of cards, and it is organized by suit and chronologically within suit. Seems very low entropy, right? Because it's well organized. If your perspective is suit and order within suit, but what if from your perspective, order was all of the reds together, all of the blacks together, or all of the twos together, all of the threes, all of the aces. Well, now we're at a high, from that perspective, it's a high degree of entropy. And all time goes with the direction of entropy, but entropy exists randomly. It's arbitrary and a matter of perspective. And so is time. There is no universal time. There's only time as we perceive it from a perspective in a small physical system, a closed physical system, which is kind of another elaboration of what Wigner was getting at. But so I'm not metaphysical. I refuse to speculate beyond that. But there are things that we know, and there are things that we know we can't know. And much of physics today is metaphysics. Sean Carroll and his multi-worlds, which actually, or the multiverse theory, those are all metaphysical speculations of what we cannot possibly know. Anything that happened before just several microseconds after the Big Bang is stuff we cannot possibly know. There's no point in going on about it. Which gets us back, again, that takes us back to Kant's antinomies and transcendental illusion. The whole question of, is the universe finite or infinite? Did it have a first cause or didn't? It's a nonsensical metaphysical question. You can't possibly know. First of all, it takes place outside of time and space, and you're imposing temporal spatial concepts where it doesn't belong. And second, it goes beyond what we can ever experience. And anytime we apply reason to what we can't experience, we're in the metaphysical transcendental illusion, which is part of why I reject. But I will not. I don't go along. I think Carroll's multi-worlds is a fascinating idea, and I approach it with the suspension of disbelief the way I would any other interesting story. I don't believe it.
Okay. So I'm curious then, because on your conversation with Craig Reed, I made the comment that it seems like that you were saying that you said you were a physicalist. And I took that as sort of like a metaphysical position, saying something like all that exists are physical things. Now, you responded in that comment, but how would you sort of respond in saying how that's not a sort of metaphysical position?
That's much like a theist telling me that as an atheist, that's a theistic position. It's a word game. Okay. I refuse to consider anything outside of the physical because I have absolutely no reason to believe it exists. And second, I can trace the history of the metaphysical error, where it began, how it developed, and it has all the appearance of an error. It goes back to Heidegger's rather radical deduction of metaphysics. Just real briefly, he said we began that error around the time of Socrates, when we turned A equals A is A. Okay, A is A, and in that the is not a copula. It's the most active verb of all. A is A, and we turn that to A equals A. And as soon as we do that, we have negated being and moved it to the metaphysical realm, because now we've got two things that are objects bereft of what made them unique beings. We have eliminated how they are beings and instead equated them as two
generalities.
Generalities, empty
right.
concepts.
So, sort of like saying Socrates and a man is a man is just taking the generality of man and then like removing the particularities of who Socrates was as a particular individual person.
That's a way of looking at it. Socrates is the interesting question. How is he Socrates? Socrates is a man, that's A equals A, and it doesn't tell me about Socrates or men. It takes all of the content, all of the essence, all of the reality, and negates it in this world and says it's up there in the metaphysics somewhere. It's in the ideal realm. That's where essence really comes from, and that was our initial error that lasted for 2,500 years until you get to the 20th century, and you have guys as different but as brilliant as Wittgenstein and Heidegger saying, the last 2,500 years is a metaphysical error. Wittgenstein's remedy to that was stop being philosophy. Just stop it. Don't philosophize anymore.
Guys, stop it.
What we got to do now is go get the flies out of the bottle. And what he meant was every metaphysical question is an error, and it puts a fly in a bottle, and we got to go help those flies out of the bottle. Let's just untangle every metaphysical question and proposition is a language error, and let's get back to real language in the real word games and untangle all that metaphysical nonsense. Heidegger said, let's end philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. That was a 2,500-year metaphysical error. Let's go to poetic language and poetically think the essence of being. Two entirely different approaches to the realization of a 2,500-year metaphysical error, all based on language errors.
Okay, so you'd said that you consider yourself a physicalist in that you have no reason to believe that anything other than the physical exists. Right. Now, I'm curious, how would you sort of respond to, say, the various idealists who would say that they have no reason to believe that the physical exists because all notions of the physical are sort of like inferential leaps beyond our phenomenal experiences? Like you take somebody like Berkeley, who says that everything are ideas within the subject, or somebody like Kant, who thinks that everything is sort of like the illusions of the categories within our own minds, or something like that, or somebody like Donald Hoffman. Yeah.
First of all, I think that mischaracterizes Kant. He was an empiricist who believed in a physical reality, the essential nature, the in itself nature we can't know, but we can know objective scientific things about them. They very much exist outside of our minds.
But wouldn't he say that, like, going into free will, even that, like, determinism is true of the sort of our experiences, but not true of the noumenal, not true of the what it is as it is?
That's right, but our objective knowledge is also true. Our objective knowledge is an aspect of that truth that we can deal with. It's our representation, but it's our representation of conditioned sense data. So it's not an illusion. The objective world for Kant was not illusory. It was representational. But it's true that in the noumenal, which we cannot know, time, space, and causality don't exist. It'd be hard for causality to exist where there's no time and space. And what Kant thought was, we live objectively. That's our world. But we have reason is our one way of short circuiting the objective causality, because it's our direct route to the noumenal, and it's our way of overcoming causality. And that's how you get free will, is through reason. Now, that's a hugely problematic argument. And if we get to free will, we'll talk about that a bit. He was flat out wrong. But in his scheme of things, it was reason that took us to the noumenal world, and that's why we could have categorical imperatives, which were really just legislating good logic. That which you can will for yourself, and will is a general law of nature. But that was how he saw these two worlds, the metaphysical noumenal world, absolutely he did, and the objective world that we lived in, which was our representation, but was a valid world also, but caught in the causal chain. And Will, he called, in the critique of reason and in the critique of practical reason, he equated reason with will, which is a hugely important word in German philosophy, and later said will is God. So that was, what he did in essence was try to find a middle way between rationalism and empiricism.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, we cannot know anything other than through the senses. But we have this divine gift of reason that helps us make sense of things. And it also helps us to, so he preserved that ideal realm. He was an idealist.
Yeah, I mean, he had the synthetic a prioris, though. So that would be like the knowledge that we have not through sense experience, but rather within the categories of what allows us to even have sense experience in the first place.
Well, it's what allows us to make sense of the sense experience. It forms it into something that we can grasp that isn't reality in itself, but it's close enough that it has practical value for us.
Right. Okay. So then maybe leaving aside Kant, how would you respond to the idealists such as Berkeley or Donald Hoffman or Schopenhauer who think that we have no reason to believe that the physical exists?
I would disagree with that with Schopenhauer also. Schopenhauer's big move was taking Kantian epistemology and reversing the ontology. What Schopenhauer said was there is no metaphysical realm. There's will. Will is, just as Kant said, will is the fundamental. It is the animating force of the universe, but it's within the universe. It is not metaphysical. And that's what Nietzsche picked up when will became music. But yeah.
Okay, so I thought like by metaphysical, we were talking about like what must be true in order to make sense of our experiences, or not. Actually, no, sorry. To make sense of our experiences would be like something to do with our epistemology. What must be the case in order for us to have the experiences that we do have? Like, I think that Schopenhauer was definitely a realist in regards to there is the will and the representations that the will produces. And so his sort of response to Kant was Kant was saying that we cannot know the thing in itself. Schopenhauer was saying that no, we have our direct experience of the will. That's like what we have firsthand, and that's and we know it from the inside rather than as just a sort of representation that Kant was pointing out. Like we know there's something it's like to be ourselves without having to inferentially arrive at the conclusion that there must be something it's like to be John Buck. I know it firsthand.
Right, that is true, but the important difference is what grounds it. Okay. And for Schopenhauer, it is not grounded in reason. It is grounded in will that he specifically said was not conscious. It had no intention, no goal. It was irrational. It was physical. It's what animates this physical universe. There's nothing beyond the physical universe. There are no Platonic ideals.
Well, Schopenhauer was an idealist, though.
Well, not really. He wasn't.
Okay.
There were idealists in the sense that we have certain cognitive structures that structure the world into a representation, but that representation was just like with it was even more extreme than Kant. It almost becomes close to an illusion, and with Nietzsche it does become an illusion. But the underlying reality was not our cognitive constructs, it was will. And will was this non-teleological, non-conscious, just urge. It was just urge. And that's what powered the universe. There was nothing beyond that. It wasn't outside. It wasn't metaphysical in that it wasn't outside the physical. It was the essence of the physical in this universe. Now, the idealism comes in the cognitive subjective structures, much as it did with Kant, but with Kant, it was directly infused, as with the rationalists, from God. With Schopenhauer, it could have just been an error.
Right. So wouldn't Schopenhauer, though, say that, like, when we say mathematically, or let's say when we're like doing science or something like that, and we're like using our empirical observations, these are all representations of the thing in itself, and the thing in itself is not of the same kind of thing as what it looks like. It's rather the thing in itself is the will that it has. Like if we're looking at some sort of atom, there's some sort of will driving it that you can't empirically observe.
That's true. Well, I said that too quickly. The will itself we represent to ourselves but can we know it directly? There's almost hints of it that you get. I mean, when you get to Nietzsche, who further developed Schopenhauer, yes, absolutely, we can know it. We know it through music. We know it through aesthetics, but we don't know it objectively. And that kind of carries through the 20th century. But what I would say to an idealist is, first of all, I can measure sensory input, so I know it's coming in. I know I'm not imagining it. And second, that would put me on the level of Shakespeare, because I guess I have written his entire body of work, which I'm pretty sure I didn't do. It just...
Yeah, the idealist is not committed to solipsism. The idealist is just committed to the position that at base level of reality, there is mental substances and not physical substances.
Yeah, okay, but then we have to go back to the era of metaphysics. There is no such thing as substance. We know now in 21st century physics that substance was just another of those metaphysical errors. There's no such thing as substance, and much of we've got 2,500 years of failure to satisfactorily answer questions because the questions were nonsensical themselves. If we try to look at things as a matter of substance, you end up with substance dualism, all kinds of things that you will never resolve because they're imagining things that don't exist. There is no substance. There just isn't any. There's only quantum waves in an incredibly complex symphony.
Well, those are substances.
No, they're not substances.
Well, do they have causal power? Do they have properties?
I don't know if they have properties. I don't even know if they have causal powers, since at the elementary level, there isn't anything like deterministic causality at all. There's just cosmic foam. But why would, if it did have causal powers, why would that make it a substance rather than just empty energy?
Well,
because even like the different types of quantum fields are not substantially different. They're just different in oscillation. They're all vibration, but at different oscillations. There's no substance there.
Well, what's oscillating if not a substance?
Just the empty quantum field.
Well, you can't have nothing oscillating. You have to have something that's there that has
nothing. It isn't nothing. It's vibration.
So it's something.
That's all. No, but it's not substance.
Okay.
How would you define substance in that context?
Like in the context of like strict
of quantum reality? How would, in quantum fields, how would this, the category of substance, even apply? What would it mean?
You could say that a substance is a measured what is it? The measured superposition, I guess, or like after the superposition has been measured. Maybe that's what you want to say a substance is.
Actually, in the quantum fields, you don't even have superposition at that point. You just simply have waves of quantum activity or energy.
Well, it
There's
depends
no substance there.
There's like 11 different interpretations of quantum mechanics, so I don't know which one should be maybe the route I take in this, because like I think within any of them, you're going to have some type of substance reference that we're going to have to be talking about here.
I don't see that. I mean, you've yet to explain how that would be substance.
Okay,
there is I mean, no matter, there is not one single satisfactory interpretation of quantum mechanics. The only honest one is the Copenhagen interpretation, because it refuses to interpret. but there is widespread agreement among 21st century physics that the most elemental reality that we know, and it precedes quanta, so you can't have superposition, are the quantum fields. That is, in some of them we measure. We know they're there.
Right.
We know they're different, but they are just vibrations in a field. There's no substance to it. There's no matter to it.
Okay, well, if there's no matter to it, that seems to be a problem for physicalism.
No, that's another common misconception. It conflates matter with the physical, and that's not necessarily true. I mean, energy is also the physical, but at the quantum level, I mean, matter doesn't even, what matter is a representation, first of all, but what we represent to ourselves as matter only arises emergent when the Higgs field interacts with another field in a way that creates what we represent to ourselves as mass. And until you get that, you don't have any matter. You just have waves.
Okay, so let's take the Copenhagen interpretation then and just say that a substance is whatever, when measured, has some definite ascription, I guess, that could be made of it.
But that isn't the Copenhagen interpretation. They would never have said a substance. They don't describe it in any way at all.
Well, yeah,
the Copenhagen interpretation,
scientific theory is going to be purely a description of our observations, and then it takes metaphysics in order to, like, how do we interpret these observations of our theories of our observation. How do we make sense of that in regards to, like, what is actually?
And that's exactly what the Copenhagen interpretation refuses to do, because they won't go into any metaphysical speculation. Niels Bohr was a radical Kantian, and he absolutely refused to go beyond what the senses told him. And when you get to the Schrodinger equation, he said it's just a mathematical equation that seems to somewhat accurately predict probabilities of, and he goes, I'm not even going to say that it's probabilities of a real world, because we have no clue. We can't even grasp it. So just consider it a mathematical equation for probabilities. He certainly would not have labeled anything a substance. He didn't even grant it reality.
Okay, so what about regarding the macro world? Wouldn't there, like, be some sort of definite state of the cat being either dead or alive?
That's an open question. According to Carroll, both happen off on different timelines.
Right.
Which is a metaphysical speculation. I don't know that that's what happens. According to others, it never, in fact, the wave function never really collapses. What happens is we collapse it subjectively when we observe it, because we have to take it into one causal timeline within time and space. So we block out everything else. It's kind of what Ravelli gets at. He said, one of Ravelli's sayings is, time is ignorance. We can only sense time or a timeline when we become ignorant of when we focus on something infinitesimally small and become ignorant of the rest of the universe. And it's kind of what might be happening with what we look at as collapse of the wave function. It doesn't actually collapse. We just purposely pick the events to look at to form a timeline and ignore everything else. And that's exactly why time is local, and there are many, many times. When he goes through the example of what would they be doing on Mars at this exact moment? Well, this exact moment doesn't exist on Mars. It's a nonsensical question. Time is extremely small and local, and it only comes about by being ignorant of the vast majority of the universe. And that's the same thing with wave collapse. We subjectively focus on one position and have no knowledge of the rest of the positions because we can't make sense of that. We'd be overwhelmed.
All right, so maybe we should sort of lay out what we mean by metaphysics and from that metaphysical knowledge. Because, like, I guess if I were to, like, compare and contrast physical knowledge versus metaphysical knowledge, I would say physical knowledge is just, let's say, the knowledge of what appears to us to be the case. And then metaphysical knowledge would be where we know what is beyond, I guess, our appearances of what is the case.
And I would say, how would you know that other than simply imagining it?
I guess it would be through the appearances and then making some sort of inference beyond the appearance.
Yeah, but how would you know that that has any validity? Just like Carroll's many worlds, he's speculating off of measurements and appearances. Okay, we know that it appears to us that there's a wave collapse. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But anytime we observe it, we know that's the case. But we also know that time and space don't have, because of entanglement, we know that the realm is not, there's non-locality in the quantum realm. So time and space mean nothing. So anything, we can't grasp it. Anything that we say about it is stuff that we not only can't know, we can't imagine. Try to imagine something that doesn't exist in space and time. You cannot do it. We're not equipped to do that. Our cognitive functions didn't evolve to do that. They evolved to escape our predators and catch our prey. It evolved to simplify the world into something manageable that we can have some limited predictability for and make plans. It has nothing to do with cosmic reality at all, and we can't grasp it. It exists outside of our meager grasp of the universe. So how could you even begin to authentically speculate metaphysically?
Right. So I guess we'd want to start with what we know most assuredly, and then from there see what we can sort of move outwards from that. So I know most assuredly that there's something it is like to be myself, John Buck. There's
Mm-hmm.
some sort of something going on around here. And then from there, I can like make certain inferences from the fact that, oh, you appear similar to I. When I look in the mirror and I make motions, I recognize that, oh, I sense some sort of like connection between my appearances and what it's like to be me, John Buck. And then I see that, oh, you have similar appearances to me. So I'm assuming I'm making that same sort of inference that there must be something it's like to be Jeffrey Williams.
Right.
So that would be, I think at least, the fact that I know that there's something it's like to be me is a type of metaphysical knowledge. And it's not any inferentially based metaphysical knowledge.
Sure
either.
it is. You know what it's like to be you because you've experienced you. If you had never experienced you, you would have there's just no a priori knowledge of what it's
Right.
like to be you. Your set of experiences. So you know that through the senses. You know that physically, not metaphysically. You also have sense data that I exist, and you see certain similarities between your existence, but you can't go much beyond that. But as far as you've gone there, there's nothing metaphysical. You are simply you are theorizing within sense data and not going beyond that.
So maybe I'm like collapsing the physical sense experiences of what it's like to be me and collapsing that to the metaphysical to say that what it is to be me is to have sense experiences, maybe.
No, because you know you have sense experiences essentially. You know you have your sense experiences because your senses tell you I'm having this experience. You know that through experience, through the senses. That wasn't an a priori thing that you knew.
So in order to have metaphysical knowledge, you must know it a priori. You can't utilize a posterior knowledge and then inference from there.
You can't infer to the metaphysical without going into what kind of called transcendental illusion. But what I'm saying, but that wasn't the point I was making. The point I was making is that you know that you are John Buck with these, and I know what it's like, for you to know what it's like to be John Buck is you learned that through sense data. You didn't come into this world knowing that. You came into this world, without experience, and through experience, you developed your knowledge of John Buck, and you will continue to do that throughout your life. But it's all from experience.
So is it a unjustifiable leap then to go from the sense experience of being John Buck to assert that there is something that is John Buck?
That's a very difficult question, and I can answer that in several ways. But what I would say is the question's unnecessary. You're John Buck, and that's just the brute fact. What it means to be John Buck. It means to be the guy that is your physical manifestation with your exact experiences and knowledge from sense data. Why do you need more than that?
I guess I'm not sure of what, I guess, the question is, because if what it is to be John Buck is, maybe I'm not quite sure if I understand, there's the sense data I am having of being John Buck, and then there's the assertion that there is something that exists that is referred to as John Buck.
Sure, but none of that is metaphysical. That is a conclusion drawn directly from sense data. You didn't need to leave the physical realm.
Yeah, right. So couldn't you arrive at metaphysical conclusions through sense data?
No, that's where you get into the transcendental illusion. You can't know anything outside of. You not only can't know anything outside of physical reality, you can only know a small sliver of physical reality. And so you can make metaphysical errors in one of two ways, but they're both from beyond sense data. One of them is to imagine a metaphysical explanation for what you see in front of you, but there's no reason to assume any of that. The other would be to impose your innate categories of the understanding and sensibilities on a world where that doesn't exist. Both of those are metaphysical errors because it goes beyond what you can possibly know in this physical world. Anything that goes beyond what you can possibly know is transcendental illusion, and there's no need to take it seriously. So,
I think we're utilizing two different types of epistemology here. I sort of laid out my theory of what it means to have knowledge, and I also laid out what it means to have at least one type of justification. There's also other types of justification that you can have, and I'm not sure. It seems like you're sort of rejecting one or both of those and utilizing much stronger epistemology, but it's a type of epistemology that prevents any type of knowledge of things as they actually are from being accessible to us.
No. Objective scientific knowledge, yes, that's true, and that's why analytic philosophy floundered in the mid 20th century. Aesthetic knowledge will give you unmediated access to the essence of physicality or being, but you know that in a very different way, and it's not the sort of thing that's going to be categorized, approached through propositional logic or put into a system. In reality, it's not systematic, but through aesthetic knowledge, you can gain an unmediated, not a mediated, but an unmediated connection to that underlying reality. Music will get you there, poetry will get you there, art will get you there. But it's the kind of thing that you can't really say. I mean, tell me about the experience of Beethoven's Symphony Number 6. You can't put it in words. You have to hear it.
Yeah.
But it's profound, and it's profoundly true. So you can know things about the nature of being, but you can't know them objectively. You can't know them metaphysically. You can only know them through unmediated sensing.
And my experience of myself would be a type of mediated sensing?
I think it's a combination. You have an unconscious, and if you can delve into your unconscious, it becomes less mediated. Then you've got your conscious representation of who you are, which is very much mediated.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, I guess I'm using the mediated senses, and given the fact that they present themselves to me as like giving me beliefs that about the metaphysical, and I have no reason to doubt these beliefs, that gives me some justification for believing these sorts of metaphysical claims, such as I exist or something like that.
But that's not a metaphysical. I would say, again, I dispute that that's a metaphysical claim. That's a perfectly physical ontological claim that you exist. You say you exist because your sense data tells you exist.
Okay, so I think that's
how
maybe
you
where
exist is the bigger question. Yeah, how you exist authentically, that's a much tougher question, but that you exist is a brute fact that you know through your sense data.
Right. So I think I'm sort of maybe conflating ontological claims with metaphysical claims. It seems like...
I think so.
I think all ontological claims would be metaphysical claims.
Ontology is the question of being, which is what Heidegger's all about, non-metaphysically, by directly inquiring into existence itself. Nothing in resisting the temptation to make up explanations which are merely metaphysical speculations. You stay firmly within the physical, but that is the real ontology. I mean, let's go back to the A is A versus A equals A.
Okay.
Ontology got switched to some metaphysical realm with that movement, because the is was obliterated. Is gone. Okay, the is now is some metaphysical concept of ideals or whatever. And the is gone in the metaphysics, and now all we have are conceptual equals, and that was the metaphysical error. Whereas ontology is really not in the metaphysical; it's right in front of you. It's right inside of you. It's the physical world. That is the ontological question, properly thought, focuses on what physically exists. That's what ontology is, being.
Okay. Well, I guess there would also be some people that think that like you can have non-physical ontology, such as abstract entities, or
that's part of the metaphysical error that we were supposed to have gotten rid of last century. Those are just simply that was the Wigner thing, okay? That miraculous applicability of mathematics, that he meant ironically those ideals, those ideas, those concepts are constructs that we impose on the world to create some order, but they're metaphysical. Our sense data doesn't tell us that. Aesthetically, that's not what we know. That's what we impose on the objective understanding of the world. It's metaphysics, but there's no reason to believe it. Just as there's no reason to believe there's one unifying equation for the universe. There's no reason to believe that, because the universe is not computational. But we want to think of it that way.
Would it ascribing a sort of like numerical value to an object be a type of metaphysical assertion?
Yes.
So, okay, here we go. I'm going to ascribe the numerical value of 1 to this pin here and assert that I have 1 pin in my hand. Did I just make a metaphysical error here?
You made... Let me be a little more subtle with that. You made a conclusion based on some sense data that relies on the metaphysical error of the applicability of mathematics to reality. One assumes a 2, and if there are 2, there is no such thing as 2. There's only one is, and this other one is. They're not the same thing. So assigning the number 1 to that pencil doesn't tell you anything about the being of that pencil. It's superfluous information. What the pencil is and how it is an interesting question. That you've assigned the number 1 to it is not so interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not trying to get around like what's the most interesting question here. We're trying to get at like what can we say that's true about reality. And so
right, and I don't think that you naming it number 1 is anything other than a convention. It's not ultimate reality. That pencil is going to be exactly the same in its being, whether you label it number 1 or you don't label it number 1. It's meaningless.
What if I labeled it 2? With the understanding of like a numerical value of 2, rather than just like, oh, I'm changing the name of 1 to 2.
A numerical value of what?
So like, even if I have 2 pencils in my hand, and then I say that I have 2 pencils in my hand, that's also a metaphysical error?
Yes. But a very practical one. There's a difference here. Remember I said there's 2 ways we can go metaphysical, but they both go beyond what we can possibly grasp. When you say I have 2 pencils, first of all, it's derived from sense data. But what you've done is objectify that sense data which takes the being away. That's the Heideggerian radical deduction.
But I thought we could make ontological claims because while still retaining, these are just physical
easily
claims.
Yeah, that is an ontological claim. I got this pencil. I've got this pencil.
But you don't have two pencils.
But if I don't, then I'm lying because I only have one. My ontological claim has to match reality. If I've got one pencil, I've got this pencil. This pencil right here. I'm not even saying I've got one pencil. I'm saying I've got this pencil. And if I have another one, I would say I've got this pencil and this pencil. And I'm making ontological statements.
Without doing metaphysics.
Without doing metaphysics.
I see.
When I say I've got two pencils, I've now raised them up to an emptier concept, and I've taken away their individual being. Now,
so is it that like making metaphysical claims is a sort of disconnection from our phenomenological reality, maybe?
I don't say phenomenological because that is metaphysical. From our sense reality. Our
Isn't that phenomenology though?
State. No. Phenomenology is purely representation, and it's a metaphysics. It works entirely in the A equals A realm, not A is A, which is why Heidegger gave it up. It looks at the world as objectification, how the sense data comes in, how we objectify it. It's real fancy Kantianism. That's it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not really familiar with the Heideggerian turn that he took. I was only familiar with the sort of phenomenological sort of basis that he had. I see that we've already gone for like an hour and a half. Do you want to go into a little bit of free will?
Let's do a little bit of free will.
Okay.
I enjoyed I enjoyed the debate. I was just my own personal opinion. It's an unanswerable question, at least at this point. I tend toward the suspicion that there is free will. And I think that it really comes down to, is the world deterministic or is it not deterministic?
Right.
And everything in 21st century physics at the leading edge, especially in quantum fields, says it's not deterministic. It's not computational. It's not deterministic. Now, if mind turns out to be quantum, and I think Penrose is on a real interesting course there with his or theory. Then there is, free will is certainly physically possible. Now, I think we have to rethink what free will is. The modern improvements on the Libet experiment preserve that half second of mental activity before we're aware that there's a decision. So there's now we know now where in the brain these things take place, but we don't know what's taking place. What would free will be? What's taking place in that half second before we are of the sensation that we just made a free choice? What's going on in there? It's a very problematic sort of thing. I don't think we can answer that right now. I think reason is the least plausible because reason itself is deterministic. If you're going to be Kantian and ruled by reason, there is nothing more mechanistic than a syllogism. So that's determinism.
Well, there's the interesting fact about syllogisms is that, like, if you don't like one of the premises, you can just do a Morian shift and then just take the conclusion, deny it, and then just arrive at a completely different sort of conclusion from that.
You could, but now you're subverting the purity of reason. But moreover, what's causing you to do that?
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. You could assume that there's some sort of antecedent condition necessitating my performing that Morian shift, or if you think that mental causation is a thing and it's not something that's externally imposed but rather internally expressed, which I don't know.
Well, and the interesting thing about Penrose is it's neither. It's complementary. It is equal work between. It's entanglement. Okay, entanglement between a quantum mind and another event that you're connected to physically. At the quantum level, everything
or multiple things potentially.
Yeah. But what it is, it's a reduction. It's a reduction of the from of the wave function to one outcome.
And that's the thing, like, even if indeterminism is the case, even if there is a sort of quantum model of the mind that seems most plausible, that doesn't even necessarily get you to a libertarian free will in the sort of sense that I'm meaning. Because, like, I think Christoph Koch has brought up how that, like, if the quantum effects are other than ourselves, then yeah, we would have a sort of quantum model of the mind that would be indeterministic, but it wouldn't be agentially caused by ourselves. It would just be sort of like a fluctuation of the quantum field that just caused me to do this action and when I could have done that action instead. And that to me at least isn't a type of free will that I'm interested in getting at.
We would have to rethink what free will is, but I don't know that we are simply that arbitrary. Quantum doesn't work completely indeterminate. The indeterminacy has to do, I mean, when they talk about Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle, that has to do with something else, okay? That has to do with we can't do velocity and location at the same time. That's different. Quantum behaves probabilistically. If we can describe it mathematically at all, it isn't completely at random. There are
higher likelihoods for things. Yeah. And that's a confusion I have with the many worlds interpretation is it seems like, yeah, sure. When Sean Carroll talks about like the photon could go left or it could go right, there's a sort of 50, like the world's split, or maybe the world was already split and time just moves forwards in both of those splits. That seems to make sense given a sort of like 50-50 chance. But I'm wondering like, okay, what about when there's a 97% chance and a 3% chance? Does the world just split 97 times this way and then 3 times that way? Or like,
that same question has occurred to me. I take your point on that because I've wondered about that too. But on the other hand, to really wonder about it, I would have to take multi-worlds far more seriously than I do.
Right, yeah.
I'm not chasing metaphysical speculation, so I don't care.
Gotcha. It's interesting, but yeah, it seems like surely there's got to be like better theories than this than rather postulating like every single possible action is performed. And I don't know, it just seems like a lot of inflationary thinking.
Oh, it is. It is. And so is multiverse. Multiverse is really just the implications of some calculations in string theory. It is not. There's no it's not observable. It doesn't come from sense data. It is the result of the new metaphysics, which is physics trying to describe the world mathematically. That's the new metaphysics, and that's as useless as medieval scholastic metaphysics.
Right.
But
so go ahead. Oh, well, I was just going to ask, like, what do you think of the particular argument that I gave that is sort of relying upon the fact that there are some moral failures that take place where people had ought to have done something and then did otherwise than that?
It is, but it's predicated on what I think is a kind of a circular premise of what implies can, which is really just another way of putting your conclusion in the premise that there is such a thing as libertarian free will. I don't know that what implies can. Other than through a linguistic trick, I can make that I can say that. but I don't know that that's actually true.
I will
I don't
say,
even,
ought implies can does not entail that libertarianism is true. It could
no,
potentially be the case that all instances in which some persons perform their obligation, they only could have done that action. But of course,
it,
I think it's empirically obvious that people do other than what they had ought to do.
well, I don't know if it's empirically obvious that there's an ought.
Right. Yeah. And that's the other route that people can take, is that if there's no actual obligation as to what actions we should perform either for ourselves or for other people, then the whole argument sort of falls flat. But I think, at
Right.
least, especially within philosophy, I'm surprised by how significant moral realism has sort of taken stride within. Now, of course, like what's popular among philosophers is really just a sort of measure of like what's fashionable among philosophers, and not really nothing to get at like what's the truth of the matter. But I think I do find it at least interesting and possibly a persuasive move that could be taken for the people that are already inclined towards a moral realism of some type.
Right, but you only really find that among analytic philosophers, which I don't take any more seriously than Heidegger took phenomenologists. Those are both obsolete, dead things. But if you're a philosophy professor and you have to publish, it's an easy thing to do. Becoming an authentic thinker like Heidegger or Wittgenstein, well, in the 20th century, two guys managed that. And that would put a lot of professors out of work. So I just, honestly, ever since I left, I graduated the undergraduate program, I have never looked at analytic philosophy again.
Good for you. And that's the thing, like, when comparing like the various philosophers within history, you gotta love the continental guys way more than the analytic guys. I mean, like, sure, analytic contemporary philosophy is sort of interesting, but it's like very much like the same arguments over and over again, like just putting forward one position, responding to that, and it's not as like engaging as like reading Sartre or Nietzsche or Heidegger or Schopenhauer or anything like that.
Or Kierkegaard, that's where the real thinking takes place. And there's a reason that all of the founders of analytic philosophy, other than Russell, went on to denounce it. I mean, Quine denounced it. Carnot became a pragmatist. Wittgenstein said it was, it was one of the worst frauds ever perpetrated. Now we got to get the flies out of the bottle. That there's anybody.
A.J. Ayer as well. He rejected his verificationism.
That anybody still takes it seriously is I would say it's a mystery, but I know why they do it. They do it for professional reasons, and it's a way of pretending you're a real philosopher when in fact you're not. So I really pay very little attention to analytical. When I went to graduate school, I was admitted to the Committee on Social Thought, which is an interdisciplinary. It's the top non-scientific program at University of Chicago, and I never had to look back at analytic philosophy again. What I studied was modern intellectual history, which I defined as beginning in the late Renaissance, from the aspects of philosophy, physics. That's why I talk about philosophy and physics. That's what I studied. And economics, which is how I made my living for 30 years, and psychology. So from those four aspects, I studied intellectual modern history. And I had access to anybody in the university I wanted. There were very few people in the philosophy department I wanted, but there were people like Paul Ricoeur in the divinity school who were very important. Guys like Clayton Kelb in the German department, and the chairman of the committee at the time was Saul Bellow, who was a huge influence. So I things like planting and height and that's not it's trivial. I don't pay any attention. Do we have any questions for a minute? Is anybody still there? If so, are there any questions or comments?
Mark Angelotti and Craig Reed have been consistently here. Thanks guys for showing up.
Do they have any questions? I know Craig
Sure.
says exactly. He must have been agreeing with me on something.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very much in agreement with a lot of stuff you were saying. Craig, come on. You're supposed to be on my team here.
I think we've lost them all at this point. They're all just like with Craig. It's like, what the hell are these guys talking about? Well, if there are no questions, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say Mark at one point agreed with me, but I'm not sure at what point that was. So
we'll correct them later.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Hey, John, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you for joining me for this.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Like, I'll admit, at one point I had you blocked on Twitter, and I can't even remember why.
Who you were. And it's like I clicked on your, and I don't even know this guy, and he's got me blocked.
I forget what it was. I don't know. I usually I'll like track. I don't know. I could probably track down to see what it was, but I remember seeing this guy. Like, man, he's just another one of annoying atheist on Twitter. I'm just gonna block him now, just to sort of get around it. Well, but I listened to your conversation with Craig Reed and Kyle Allender, and I was like, well, okay, I was wrong about this guy. There's a real thoughtful person here that's willing to engage with the other side, willing to actually like put in the hard work in trying to understand the philosophy. And so, like, okay, well, I gotta unblock him now, and I gotta come on his channel. So I'm really glad I did. Thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm glad that you came. I mean, I'm not first and foremost an atheist. I'm first and foremost. I think like you know what some people think of as philosophy, and Heidegger wouldn't. I draw from the Heideggerian tradition. I want to understand being, and to do that, I want to understand other people's perspectives, because I've got this one little tiny narrow perspective that tells me only so much, and I want to understand how other people see this too. Like I said, I'm an atheist because my philosophy took me from Christianity to atheism. I'm firm in that conviction, but I can certainly understand why not everybody agrees with me. And I'm so glad that you listened to what I had to say also. And we'll need to do this again sometime if you're willing, because I really enjoyed this conversation.
Love to. Yeah. I'll admit I have to do more study on like what it is that we're meaning when we're talking about what's metaphysics versus like what's ontology and things like that. So
Well,
I recently just bought Being in Time. Would you recommend anything else from Heidegger?
First thing I'd recommend is throw that away.
Okay. Oh, great.
Seriously, he did.
Okay.
Do you speak German?
No.
Oh, he's untranslatable, but the closest,
great.
the closest that I have ever seen to something in translation making sense of Heidegger was a collection of essays in a volume called Poetry, Language, Thought. And it's translated by a guy whose last name is Hofstetter. I believe he's at the University of Santa Cruz, or at least he used to be.
Douglas Hofstadter?
No.
Okay.
No,
because he has this like book on consciousness that's pretty wild.
Yeah. No. I think his name is Albert Hofstadter. It's Hofstedter. Poetry, Language, Thought. It's got some of the absolutely most important of Heidegger's post-turn thinking, which is the only thinking that counts.
Yeah. Was his like essay on technology before or after his turn?
That was right during the term, and it also the essay on technology is where really he first goes into A is A versus A equals B.
Okay.
It's in it's very early turn. Then he had a collection of essays in German, Holzwege, means paths in the woods. Some of those more important ones are in the Hofstadter collection of essays. But yeah, without reading German, it's really tough.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I'll have to learn. I mean, like,
if you have any questions or want to talk about it or what it would be in the German, I'm available anytime to discuss it. I taught Heidegger Nietzsche
cool.
and Kant for a while. Heidegger is, what I've studied more than anything. I'm fluent in German. I'm as good in German as I am in English.
Nice.
So I know what he writes poetically. Remember, you understand the world poetically. Heidegger wrote poetically, post-turn. And poetry does not translate,
Right.
especially when
I
it's as
see.
profound and thought out as Heidegger's. It's all having to do with how words work in the German language, and it doesn't translate. So ask lots of questions. I can help you with that.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks again, Jeffrey, for
Hey,
doing this.
yeah. And if anybody else is out there, of a philosophical bent who'd like to come on, let me know. I'm always looking for people to talk to. Thanks a lot, John. Talk to you later.
All right. See ya.